Hello, I'm Mira Ricardel, principal at the Chertoff Group. Thank you for joining today's session on Deciphering Biden's defense budget. We have a powerhouse panel that will dive into critical aspects of the defense budget. To get us started, I'm pleased to introduce David Taylor, CEO of Federal Budget IQ, one of the Chertoff Group's close and key partners. He will set the stage for us with his key Pentagon budget findings and implications for policymakers. David, thank you for being with us today.
Glad to be here today. Thanks for having me. First, I would like to pull up a slide, if I could.
Please do. We can't do Pentagon budgets without slides.
There we go. This slide here is our display of the funding range that we think is likely for DoD over the next 5 years. The top line is from Secretary Esper's National Defense Strategy. He testified on several occasions that funding that meant at least 3% above inflation. So our proxy, just for simplicity's sake, is to assume 5% growth over that period. So that's the top line. The yellow line is the future years defense program, which is the cost DoD estimates for the out-year implementation of the FY21 budget that was approved, right? So that's a real kind of planning guide DoD uses. The blue line is the Congressional Budget Office estimate of what it costs to maintain current services. And there's a unique wrinkle in FY21 where funding actually drops, and that's because in FY20 there was $9 billion worth of damage from hurricanes to facilities in North Carolina and Florida, and we're hoping additional hurricanes don't happen in the future. So the red line is a hard freeze. We use that as a proxy for the floor on what realistic DoD funding is, even though there was an amendment offered in both the House and Senate last year to cut DoD funding 10%. We both know from our experience on Capitol Hill that often there are show vote amendments that are designed to fail, but to make a political point. Both of those amendments failed by wide margins in the House and Senate. But had they tried to cut defense less, they would have gotten more votes in both the House and Senate. So we view the freeze as a floor. So the challenge for DoD, in addition to all the national security challenges that are out there, cybersecurity, our near-peer competitors, the shift to the Pacific, all those things that the panel knows a lot about, and I'm excited to listen to that conversation. The budget is going to impact DoD decisions as well. And we view the realistic range for DoD funding over the next 5 years to be between the blue and red lines. So that means there's a $500 billion disconnect between the National Defense Strategy. I'm not arguing about what the strategy wanted to accomplish, but between implementing that, the implementation costs, and the actual funding for DoD. And that's going to drive a lot of decisions throughout the department and have big operational implications we see going forward.
So it's a huge mismatch.
It's a huge mismatch. And $500 billion is kind of the low end of our range of where we think the disconnect potentially is, particularly when you add the fact that inflation's higher than 2% this year, right? Which creates another challenge for DoD. So funding availability is going to drive a lot of decisions coming up, and we want to talk about that in a little bit. So this slide is of the defense budget. It's a snapshot of FY22 Biden. So FY21 is what was adopted last year in December. FY22 Biden shows totals across the services and then a comparison of the two. And you'll notice a couple of lines there. First of all, the military personnel costs go up $5 billion. Military personnel costs for the past several years have been rising a lot faster than inflation because of the health benefits, in part, that are attached to them. Even though the Biden budget makes some cuts to end strength, military personnel costs go up $5 billion. Civilian personnel costs go up another $1 billion. The big cuts in this budget are to procurement. And a lot of those cuts are to programs that Congress has supported consistently for years. So often budgets are done as political documents, right, to achieve certain points, to make the internal math work. For Biden, prioritizing civilian spending over defense was a big political priority for him. We've seen civilian spending rise dramatically. The two agencies in his budget that grow the least are DOD and DHS, right? Political. Biden's budget is unrealistically low. We've already seen that as the House has started moving the appropriations bill through committee this week. What Biden does is cut procurement that has a lot of, there are a lot of jobs attached to these programs. There are broad constituents for these programs. We've seen the House Democrats in their budget reject his plan to reduce the number of destroyers produced this year. There's a $1 billion difference there. We think it's only going higher. So budgets are going to be a limiting factor going forward, but there's some real bright spots we see moving ahead. So if I could pull up the next slide. So this is our, in an homage to Letterman. I'm a big Dave Letterman fan. This is our top 10 defense trends. And I'm hoping this kind of sets up the conversations that's coming later. At the beginning of this, we'll do it from 10 to 1, are the budget drivers that we just talked about. So DOD, the current services gap, the gap between the amount of money DOD actually gets and current services, we expect to grow over the next 5 years, back to that $500 billion disconnect we talked about. The second one is the first operational impact of that. We expect military end strength to change and be reduced fairly dramatically beginning in FY23, which will be the first real comprehensive defense budget for Secretary Austin, right? Mm-hmm. He didn't have a chance to do a bottom-up review in the schedule for a transition year. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact. His budget is going to be the first one in FY23 that truly reflects the Biden kind of priorities. We expect a big end strength reduction, and just the math says it will disproportionately impact the Army. That's a significant thing, and we haven't heard many people talking about that yet.
The Army tends to be the bill payer.
The Army tends to be the bill payer, and it's where the personnel are, right? If you have to manage military personnel, math says you have to look at the Army. The third item on this list, so number 8, is the pandemic did something for DoD operations that CIOs have been arguing for a long time. CIOs have argued for many years that communications networks were really mission critical for the commands. Not all commanders agreed with that, but the pandemic and the shift to remote work that we saw that was dramatic has made the commanders aware that their communications networks are mission critical. And as we look at the other implications going forward, there will be a lot of investments around securing those communications networks. The next item on the list is cybersecurity, right? So Federal Reserve Chairman Powell has said cybersecurity is the greatest threat to our economy. I would argue it's the greatest short-term threat to our national security as well. We see a lot of spending around cybersecurity tied to those communications networks, and that's going to drive a lot of other decisions we see downstream for DoD. The next item is supply chain, visibility, security, and resilience. There were a lot of lessons learned from DoD over the past 12 months. And one of the challenges for them, they built hospitals that weren't used. They deployed ventilators to places where they weren't used, is all of their indicators for managing the pandemic were lagging indicators. So one of the lessons that came out of this that the Defense Logistics Agency is focused on is the need for major investments in predictive analytics. We think that's a major change that's coming. And there's something called the Supply Chain Control Tower that they've established as the model for managing the strategic national stockpile. And we think every federal agency is going to follow this model going forward to varying degrees. And we see major investments moving in this direction. The President has executive orders on this subject. Congress is weighing in on this subject. This is a growth area going forward. So on the right side are kind of the growth areas that we see. R&D is going to be a major focus, particularly if we make the strategic shift that's called for in the National Defense Strategy, the shift that everyone knows we need to make to the Pacific to deal with our near-peer competitors. A lot of front-end investment with DARPA and IARPA. Related to that means if our edge on the battlefield is going to be technological, we need to shorten the timetable for getting procurements so we actually can leverage that technological advantage. That's going to mean advanced manufacturing and other techniques really increase as we move forward. All of this means a lot more data that DoD needs to collect. So for those in the technology community, you have a lot more data, but you're going to need a lot more intelligence around it, and you'll also need a lot more storage, right? So,
and you'll have to understand how to get to that data.
And you have
you'll
to understand.
You'll have to have those mechanisms in place as well.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. So the last 2 points I want to make are, for all these reasons, to meet these elevated missions, recognizing the defense, the budgetary constraints that DoD has to manage through. IT spending for DoD is going to grow faster than its top line for the next 5 years. And the way that's going to happen is something that we've discovered that started at DoD that we expect to hockey stick over the next few years is there's a budget lever that can be pulled that makes some of these transitions easier. And it means moving off of legacy networks faster and deploying new technologies faster, and that's by shifting to as-a-service purchasing and moving a lot of these technology purchases from capital expenditures where you have to pay the life cycle cost up front to as-a-service where you pay for it as you use it. Now that shifts risks onto those in the procurement community, but like the in-strength reduction, math says this is the way we need to move, and it's a way to increase our security as we do it. So I hope that gives you kind of a sense of some of the trends that we see and puts some constraints around a lot of the policy issues that are being discussed on Capitol Hill, and I look forward to listening to the panel.
Thank you, David. So very insightful, as always. You've pointed out that there's greater appetite than resources, but nevertheless, I think there's a lot of opportunity for the private sector to come in with solutions for these very tough problems and maybe smarter ways of buying some of these components, capabilities, and services that are needed. So thank you, David. Again, appreciate your insightful analysis. You've really set the stage for us, and we'll be able to hear some perspectives on the very critical issues that you've brought up in your presentation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here with us. I'm pleased to be joined today by Chairman Mac Thornberry, Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, Secretary Ellen Lord, and Secretary David Norquist. We heard David Taylor's presentation a short while ago, and Secretary Norquist, since you were involved in the initial preparation of the budget for FY22, what are your thoughts?
So a couple of observations. I think the first one, and sort of the most obvious, is clearly DoD is not this administration's party. You saw an increase of 1.6% less than inflation, whereas the domestic agencies were going up 16%. Now, sometimes when defense isn't going up, there's an argument of the deficit, but they're rolling out multi-trillion-dollar initiatives at the same time. So that's clearly not the argument or the case here. The second thing you saw was the messaging, right? Defense was not even mentioned when OMB did their press release related to the budget rollout, which is an unusual thing to have happen. And when the DoD rollout came, a lot of the highlighted messages there related to things like climate change and others, which are White House priorities but aren't core DoD missions. So, for example, the DoD slides mentioned climate 11 times and the F-35 once, right? Just as a sort of a focus. And the same thing is reflected in the strategy documents, where clearly state and others are in the lead and DoD is a more distant place. So this is not what they want to be talking about. That may or may not mean that when it gets to conference, they may be more flexible on the DoD number, precisely because it isn't where they've put their emphasis. When you get down to the Department of Defense level, to the credit of Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks, what you see is the stability of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. You see the same sort of messages about China as a pacing threat, some of the major decisions like standing up the Space Force. They kept the Space Force. They fully funded the Triad. This is the second year in a row where the message has been RDT&E is a major emphasis area, and so you saw that both in the previous administration's budget and this one, and it's a range of things from electronic warfare, cyber, hypersonics, microelectronics, UAVs, a series of investments that reflect the challenges and the joint warfighting concepts of the future. This stability of the vision, the emphasis on long-range strike, is very valuable to the country because when you have that stability of direction, it shows a shared understanding of what the challenge is on the direction side. And it makes it easier for those companies that are investing to understand what the future is going to look like. So that's a major step forward. The one challenge of obviously, the one exception to that is shipbuilding. I think we'll come back to that, but that's a place where there was a significant difference between what was a priority and where the funding went. The challenge flow is the top line, right? As they said, this is a relatively flat to shrinking top line, less than inflation now, and when you look over their multi-year plans, not much different than inflation in the out years. But if inflation, if those numbers were set at 2%, the pay raise was 2.7. You have the Triad, you have other things. So the rest of the budget to accommodate pay and other things is in fact going to have to shrink. When you look at what the Chinese are doing, 6 to 8% growth in their defense budget, you really need to build the defense budget around the nature of the threat, not around domestic inflation, other things. So you've got to understand that. And when you look at the challenges that China poses, the long-range precision strike munitions and so forth, that's a real big risk. And I think that the need to keep pace with the challenge is going to be what drives a lot of this discussion. Just to close, I think the one takeaway I'd give everyone is a little bit of caution is there are very few administration personnel in the Pentagon at the beginning of the administration where they're building the budget. So some of the additional people, when they come in, they'll have all summer to build the 23 budget. So what you'll see in the 23 budget, while it will strategically match the vision of the 2018 NDS and the effort laid out by Secretary Austin, Deputy Secretary, when you get down below it, you'll see a lot more individual choices that will start to drive individual programs. So we'll wait and see what 23 looks like. But those are sort of my key initial observations.
Thank you. Chairman Thornberry, how do you see things?
Well, I think on the Hill, this budget's seen as largely a status quo budget for the reasons that David just outlined. That means that it's catching criticism from all directions. Republicans don't think it spends enough. Some Democrats think it spends too much. And it will be a challenge, I think, to get authorization and appropriation bills passed and signed into law because of this criticism that comes in all directions. Of course, the unexpected could happen. There could be some event in the world that changes that. The other issue is accidents, because in the early years of the Trump administration, it was really the accidents that motivated Congress to increase the top line in defense to try to take better care of our equipment and our training and so forth. So I'd keep an eye on that. I think you've seen bipartisan criticism of the shipbuilding budget. We're retiring more ships than we're building at a time when we're trying to increase our presence, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And on the Hill, just this week, the House Appropriations Committee, obviously with a majority of Democrats, reduced the Biden R&D budget in favor of a little more procurement. So you've got that tension between building for the future and what you need right now. Last thing I'd say when it comes to the Hill is there's always other stuff that is going to be involved. It may be closing Gitmo, it may be the nuclear deterrent, it could be changes to the Uniform Code of Military Justice and how extensive those are, Or last year it was Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, which none of us had really known about until the last minute, because these are some of the few bills that go through and get signed into law. They're a magnet for all sorts of defense and non-defense issues. So I don't think we've seen all the controversy yet.
Those are some great points. Ambassador Hutchison, you served in the Senate. Perhaps you can give us your view.
Yes, I think the other tension, Mac mentioned administration versus House versus Senate will be a big tension because there is more bipartisan support in the Senate for defense. You've got much more agreement. So the House bill and the Senate bill will have to be reconciled, and that's not going to be easy. I think Mac was so right on the extraneous issues that you don't expect. But I think in the big picture, and with my time at NATO, I would say that we are all going in the same direction with regard to big power competition. The focus on China, Russia for the future is shown in nuclear modernization, and that budget is good on nuclear modernization. I think the top line is too low, and I think the Senate will plus it up. That's my guess, and then that tension will happen. But we need, if we're going to be looking toward the future, if we're going to retire the old legacy systems, which I think has been made clear, we are going to have to spend more for those new, better, modern systems. And my last point would be communications. At NATO, secure communications is really taking a high priority. And cyber and hybrid are on everyone's radar screen, and everyone wants to do more, particularly in disruptive technology. We're looking for offense as well as we have defense, but offense is what NATO would like to see more of. And I think NATO is going to want more American activity in access to space, because we have determined space as a NATO domain of operation, and we're going to have to be able to get there to be able to do what's needed for AI, cyber, hybrid, all of the things that satellites can do.
Thank you. Secretary Lord, you had oversight over so many of these programs that have been referred to, both legacy and new programs. What are your key takeaways from this budget?
Well, I use the lens of the defense industrial base. And when we have either flat or declining budgets, the industrial base is going to have to learn how to do things quicker and cheaply, more cheaply. And the Pentagon is going to have to really utilize all those authorities that Congress gave DOD and implement them quickly. So how does that come into play? First of all, we know we've been operating in the gray zone below the level of open conflict here. And the defense industrial base is really the nexus of our economic security and our national security. And we see these attacks in terms of intellectual property and so forth. So cybersecurity is going to be very, very important. Additionally, supply chain security and resiliency. So we're going to have to figure out how to do that. Now, with fewer people being employed by DOD and with industry having to be more efficient here, I think it's going to put the onus on technology utilization. So what do I mean by that? Supply chain illumination, using artificial intelligence, using digital engineering to develop in a very secure cloud environment, and allowing the small companies where most of our innovation comes from to go and not use their own systems, but develop in a secure cloud environment. And finally, I think we have to continue to acknowledge the fact that all of our major weapon systems and platforms are hardware enabled but software defined, and hardware and software are developed and fielded very differently. So we're going to have to make sure we use, again, those authorities for software to be able to develop and really field and sustain very quickly. And I think those companies that understand Agile and DevSecOps are the ones that are going to be very very, very successful. Likewise, I think the Pentagon's going to have to think about bifurcating hardware contracts and software contracts and understanding how to use the best of breed for both.
Thank you. One of the things that the Biden administration has done in this defense budget is to talk about climate change as a threat that DoD must address. And what do you think that means, Secretary Lord, for operational requirements and procurement?
Yeah. So climate is obviously a huge focus. You hear all of the times that David said it's been cited. I see a few things. One, from an operational point of view, the Department of Defense is always the agency that's called on in time of crisis. So COVID, great example, where DoD really did a lot of the acquisition for HHS and FEMA. Likewise, when there are hurricanes, tsunamis, tidal waves, all different kinds of things, that takes the DoD's operational assets, whether that be equipment or human beings, and diverts them. With more and more of these climate crises, there's going to be a drain of those resources. So again, we're going to have to figure out how to do more with less, how to use more automation. On another side of it, I think that the industrial base is going to have to think about how to reduce their own carbon footprint, how to make engines more fuel efficient, and the fact that there aren't any requirements I've seen out there right now for how climate friendly are you. I can see those coming because the dialogue is there. So again, operational issues, acquisition issues, but it will be with us during this administration. And I think those companies that acknowledge that and address that as part of their ESG approach, for instance, those are going to be well positioned.
Very interesting perspective. Ambassador Hutchison, do you think the NATO allies see it the same way, and what approach are they taking?
Well, I think Ellen pointed out some of the things that we're seeing at NATO, like delivery of COVID vaccines and the equipment to deal with that pandemic. But there's another aspect that NATO is also dealing with, and that is the difference in land mass. Land mass is growing. Greenland, usable land, Greenland, Iceland is growing, and therefore there's more interest of Russia and China. China is trying to get ports. Russia is running submarines through the North Atlantic. The high north is now becoming very much a priority as we are looking at more activity from potential challengers. And China is also trying to charge to use the Arctic waters. And I think that as we get more of the land from usable from Iceland and Greenland, it's also going to open capabilities for more operations out of there and onto other places where we would need to be. So it will have a transportation aspect as well as a more deterrence aspect. I mean, we're now looking at all the way across the Atlantic and down into the Canadian and American waters where we are seeing evidence of Russian submarines. So we're having to beef up more in North America for a base for that area because of the more operations out of our potential adversaries. So it's different things are going to affect, for sure, the things that we're going to have to deal with.
So I think I'd like to turn, you talked about beefing up certain things, and David Taylor talked about certainly the things that may have to go down in spending and institutions, the U.S. Army being one of them, the traditional bill payer and downward budget cycles. Secretary Norquist, are there any things that you expect in terms of notable cancellations, actions, program delays that are in the Army space?
So I think when you look at the services, the missions and funding, if it's done right, should go up and down with the change in the strategy and the requirements. So after 9/11, the Army's budget went up, and the navies and the air forces are the ones that were more constrained. When you look at the change to a theater like the Pacific, where very large ocean spaces, very long distances, you would expect it to be a shift in the other direction. I think that's what you're seeing. The Army budget, if it was to keep pace with inflation, would go up by $3.5 billion. Instead, it goes down by $1.5 billion. Now, first and foremost, some of those savings are coming from drawing down the presence in the Middle East and in Afghanistan in particular. Within that, the Army also flatlined its end strength at its 2020 level. So with the given costs that you've heard earlier on pay, that's going to be a challenge for the Army. What the Army worked and protected this year was what it calls its 31+4, its modernization programs. And those got increased funding. They went from $9.5 to $11.3 billion. Those are the programs the Army believes are essential for transforming it for the future fight. So they made a point of protecting those, and then there's a series of other procurement and R&D initiatives, basically all the others that were very constrained. So helicopters, ammunition, tactical vehicles. Each of those was either constrained or reduced in order to allow the Army to invest in these new mission areas as it's making this adjustment. We may see more of this as we go through into 23 and 24, because that pressure is going to be there, and that shift to the Pacific is going to continue to drive that different emphasis.
Thank you. Well, we can't talk about the DoD budget request without mentioning the much maligned, but also much praised and sought after F-35. Chairman Thornberry, what do you see as the trajectory of this U.S. Air Force big ticket item?
I think the F-35 truly is too big and too important to fail. This is what we're counting on. And so this year's budget buys, I think, about 85 of those planes. If you start to change that too much, you reduce the efficiency of the procurement system, and so you want to watch that. Two things to keep in mind. One is sustainment and operational costs. It's been a subject of a lot of criticism for that. On the other hand, as Ambassador Hutchison can tell you, the Swiss just decided to buy it, and they looked at operational costs and thought it compared favorably with other planes. The other one is probably more long-term, and that is what's the role of manned fighter aircraft when it comes to the United States and China. And so that's going to be a discussion that you continue to have. I think we've bought about 700 out of a planned 2,500 F-35s so far. So that number could be adjusted depending on sustainment operation costs and then the role of manned fighters.
Thank you. Ambassador Hutchison, I'm sure the NATO allies also have their views. They're participants in the actual building of the program as suppliers. So what is your perspective?
Yes, I think that when we talk about the efficiencies that we need to make sure that there are enough coming out, that it is affordable, the NATO allies are really stepping up. And because it's interoperable and you can train and work together, which if we're ever going to face a large operation, having the interoperable F-35s that are going to be Norway, Belgium, Italy, UK, as well as US, Swiss just came in, and others are looking at it, that is going to be a major factor, and the NATO allies are bought in. And the two things they looked at, because Ellen and I worked on Belgium and that procurement, it's the fact that the nuclear part is already accredited in an F-35, whereas if you go to another fighter plane, you're going to have to go through at least a 1.5 to 2 year accreditation to be able to accommodate nuclear if ever that's going to be required, which is a contingency, but you have to plan for that. And that was a factor for these European countries that are looking at it and the interoperability. So I think the F-35 is going to be here for a long time as the premier fighter, the interoperable NATO one, and if we ever hopefully never, but possibly have to do nuclear deterrent, then we will have the interoperable capability to do that.
Well, since you brought up nuclear capabilities, what is your prognosis for the ground-based strategic deterrent and the other modernization pieces of the triad?
Well, I think what the administration has put out is quite correct in its emphasis, and that is that all of the nuclear modernization that we know we must have for the deterrent effect is provided, but there is opposition by progressives, Democrats on the Hill, not wanting the ground-based part of the triad. And that will be a major substantive fight because you need the triad. You need it all. You're going to need defense. You're going to need missile defense. You're going to need submarine, water, sea. As we're looking at all of the potential places that we may have to be, we've got to have the triad, and I think the Senate is going to be very firm on that, but it is going to be one of the areas of tension.
I was just going to ask you about the Senate, but you beat me to it. Appreciate that perspective as well. Secretary Lord, we read about the Pentagon's change of direction with respect to the JEDI contract. What are the opportunities in the IT space? Procurement? Is it software? Is it storage? Maintenance? Could you give us some perspectives on IT modernization in the Pentagon?
Absolutely critical for the Pentagon, as everything we do needs to be data-driven. And right now, one of our challenges is data within DoD is very federated. So David actually made huge strides last administration in using Advana to bring a lot of different sources together. Now we need to look at how we have development environments, how we have enterprise systems running. I think there is enormous opportunity for multiple different industry players to set up clouds and be very focused on different needs. Technology has moved tremendously in the last few years, and there is room for many, many players. Now, this goes along with a data strategy in terms of how we deal with data. It also depends in large part on AI to make sure we take that data and transition it to information and knowledge. So again, with these flatter declining budgets, we have to work smarter and work at the speed of relevance, as Secretary Mattis would have said. So I think this is going to be a large focus area, a large spending area, and where the government-industry partnership is going to be absolutely critical.
Thank you. Chairman Thornberry, what do you think the ramifications are of having changed course on the JEDI contract?
I really think of two implications. One is, as Secretary Lord just said, accessible data is critical to any and everything we want to do at Department of Defense, from making the back room more efficient, to improving logistics, to having this joint all-domain command and control where any sensor can talk to any shooter. I mean, you got to have accessible data. So, and we just lost 3 years. Now, the services are doing their own cloud contracts. It was a misconception. This was not the only cloud contract going on in the department, but it was a big one, and we lost 3 years, and China wasn't waiting on us. Number two is what lesson comes from the way this was handled? Are companies that don't win the competition now going to say, okay, if we just appeal and file lawsuits and we can stretch this out and then we get a second bite at the apple? Are their shareholders going to demand that sort of strategy? Or can we really have a competition, make a decision, and move on? Was this a one-off, or is this the wave of the future? I think that's a really critical question, because we will never be able to be as agile as we need to if we get all gummed up with appeals and lawsuits.
It's a great point on unintended consequences. We may have some in this other area, and I'd like to turn to Secretary Norquist about this. The administration asserts that the strategic competition with China is its primary focus. And we saw the scenes, or read about the scenes, I should say, of the stealthy withdrawal from Bagram. So we're seeing the shift from fighting terrorism, to this near-peer competition. What are the core missions that you see will be elevated, and what are some of the risks we may see?
So a couple of things. You're going to see, first of all, you've seen a change in where the theater is a focus to the Pacific. You've seen a change in the type of challenge you're facing, from counterterrorism to near-peer competitors. What you're also recognizing is there's a change in technology that's gone through the United States, it's gone through and is affecting our weapon systems. And what that's doing is it's changing the character of warfare. And so the military is spending a lot of effort developing a new joint warfighting concept. But what you have is a series of ongoing investments and experiments with AI, hypersonic, cyber, electronic warfare. And if you think back to World War II, everyone focuses on the tank. Germany had tanks, France had tanks. But the challenge is the French put their tanks alongside the infantry and they advanced at walking speed. The Germans took their tanks, put their infantry on tracked vehicles in certain units, put their artillery on tracked vehicles, and had them talk to each other in a radio. Their issue wasn't the tank, it was the armored division. And then when they punched a hole, they advanced not at walking speed, but at track speed. So the Chinese, the United States, there's a series of countries investing in researching all of these technologies. And so anyone investing in these, it's a tremendous help to the United States and our security. But the challenge is going to be understanding how they come together. How does the advances in AI affect the use of unmanned platforms? How does the advances in electronic warfare affect long-range strike? Whoever understands that's in a strong position. The flip side of this is much more mundane, but in warfare, the mundane is sometimes equally, or if not more important, which is you're now moving to contested logistics. And the fancy way of phrase means when we need to move supplies into Afghanistan or Iraq, the question of getting them all the way into theater wasn't a question. We fly, we had bases, we'd land. It was only when they were in the theater that you were at risk of an attack from a terrorist group. You have to assume in a challenge in the Pacific, much like World War II, where there were submarines off the East Coast, you're going to have attacks on every step of the way. You're going to have attacks on the ports you're trying to come out of, the airfields you're trying to land on. So being able to have survivability of our bases and logistics that allows you to move those supplies over incredible distances in the Pacific, not as glamorous as the other, but no less important. So there's really two risks that come out of this. On the technology side, the risk is the vision will outrun the funding. You'll get lots of R&D, you'll have lots of experimentation, and there just won't be the shift to procurement to field these. And so you'll run into that as the risk to a person investing in that area. On the logistics side, it's more the risk of these as orphan ideas, which is there's no service for whom base defense is what they view as their primary mission, or logistics. Each of them has combat arms and areas they will prioritize. And you really need the leadership of the department and the Hill to come in and enforce and push these investments in these more mundane areas, but equally important to the success of the fight.
Thank you. Well, we're talking about risks and threats. We can't not talk about cybersecurity. And certainly, there's not a day that goes by that we don't read of another hack, ransomware attack. Secretary Lord, what do you see as the most urgent needs in the area of cybersecurity for the Pentagon?
I think there are two separate areas that have to be focused on. One is the defense industrial base and their networks and the security of those. We all read about ransomware every day and so forth. So we need to make sure we put in place the security required to make sure that they are not infiltrated. On the other hand, we need to make sure that our platforms and our weapon systems are cyber hardened. Now, the new acquisition policies and instructions make sure that that's a requirement moving through, but we have a lot of fielded systems we have to go back and patch, so to speak. So there are two separate efforts, both huge, but we need to get clarity, and we can't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. We also cannot micromanage the little pieces of it. I think as leaders, DOD needs to step up and set some standards and go execute against them and, start making progress.
I would probably think that clarity in those standards and great communication. I mean, you have to have the communication with the defense industrial base. I think that started with CMMC certifications.
Absolutely, with the cyber maturity month. Yep.
Yeah, is that just the beginning, you think, in the journey?
It is the beginning. You have to start somewhere. I use the analogy with ISO is for quality. Everybody accepts that now. Is CMMC should be for cybersecurity. And we're very fortunate that a lot of our industry associations, our defense industry associations, really helped echo and amplify the message. But more importantly, took what we were doing as we were developing CMMC and gave us critical feedback that allowed us to modify it. So I think that partnership is so very, very important. And as you say, it's just the beginning. But we need to make progress, and we need to hold ourselves accountable.
Thank you. I'm sure this is also an area where our allies and what they do has an impact. Ambassador Hutchison, could you maybe speak to what the NATO allies are doing in this space and what their approach is?
Well, it is one of the priorities for NATO as we're redoing the strategic concept that brings in the big power competition. We are also very intent on cyber and hybrid because every one of our countries has been hit in one way or another. And we need to have a more coordinated as well as better technology. And we do have a Cyber Center of Excellence in Estonia that is very good, but I do know that we are also beginning at NATO to look at setting up a DARPA-like entity that would have scientists and engineers also trying to tackle this issue with all of our NATO allies putting their best and brightest in that, and with an independence as well. So everyone is concerned, everyone has been hit, and I also had several meetings with our South American ambassadors that really were at the EU, but we reached out to them to see, because that's so important for our security, what kind of services they might require from NATO, and every one of them had been hit by cyber. There is a heavy presence of China as well as Russia and Hezbollah in South America. It's affecting us globally, and what we can do in the U.S. with the better technology, I think, is going to be really important for resilience for our South American neighbors, which affect our economies and our trade and our hemisphere. But I think it's a big issue that is very much accepted as a big issue that we haven't fully hit and solved at NATO.
Well, let's turn to naval forces. There's been a lot of debate about reductions to naval destroyers and cruisers, and we talked about, I think, or David Taylor went through kind of the mismatch between budget numbers and aspirations, and we talked about the shift to the Pacific, which is very much dependent on our naval forces. Secretary Norquist, what does this mean for these reductions mean for U.S. power projection, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative? Could you just perhaps get into that?
This is the biggest gap between the vision, China is the pacing threat, invest in the Pacific, and the budget. Right? There's a lot of improvements in R&D, a lot of investments in the way technologies, but when you look at the shipbuilding budget, you look at a declining number of ships, not keeping pace with the number being fielded, and an investment well below what you need to get up to that level in the future. And you're just not seeing the positioning of the Navy to be able to be successful in the face of the growing long-range strike capability that China has with their growing Navy. And so one of the risks about this is it's not something like, we'll go through periods where administration will underfund ammunition, and the next administration has to come in and correct that. Ships take many years to build and many years to field, and the industry has to be able to be at a steady pace. So 2 destroyers a year or 3, what you build up to. So when you curtail that, you have a ripple effect that cascades on for years and is very hard for the country to easily recover from. And so this is one of the areas that the previous administration put a lot of emphasis with this Future Naval Force study and looking at that vision. And so I really think that this is going to be a challenge, and And it's not the sort of thing that Congress can bail you out from, because if you really want to change the way your fleet looks in 30 years, one of the points of the study is you have to change the capacity of the shipyards. You have to come in with proposals to expand capacity, to change the number of subs they're buying or other items. You can't just leave it short and then expect somebody else to come in and plug that hole. And so this, I think, is going to be a contentious issue, but also one where when they produce the 6-year plan in the next budget, and you can see their multi-year vision, because they sort of sent a placeholder shipbuilding plan up, that's going to be how clear the multi-year impact of these decisions are. And that's going to create a lot of concern, because the Pacific is a pivot area. If you're not building up the Navy to keep pace, then you really put yourself in a hole.
Could you maybe speak also to whether there's a growing role for unmanned undersea vehicles, or
Absolutely.
also known as UUVs? I mean, there's a lot of talk about this. Is this something real? Is this something the Navy wants? And would it make a difference maybe in filling some of these gaps?
So there's technology issues you need to work through, right, on all of these challenges with unmanned vessels, just like we had to with unmanned aerial vehicles, and it took us some time, but you've now got incredible, powerful capability there. But when you think about the Pacific, you've got air power, you've got forces on land, forces on sea, and forces below the sea. Every one of those is a very different problem for somebody else to solve. The same weapons that target surface ships don't hit underwater platforms. And so you really have complicated their targeting. You've greatly strengthened your deterrent capability and your ability to protect a coalition of allies working in the region. So I think there's a very strong role for them to play. And as those technologies prove themselves out, particularly if they can be built and fielded faster than a surface ship, there'll be an emphasis to spend there to make up for what you can't get out of the yards in the speed and volume that you need.
Thank you. Chairman Thornberry, when you led the House Armed Services Committee, you were a real leader also on the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and the need to be serious about the focus on the threats in Asia. Could you speak to that?
Sure. We originally created this fund in the Defense Authorization Bill that passed in 2017. And we looked at the success that was happening in Europe and said we need to do that with funding exercises and pre-positioning of equipment and building partner capacity and infrastructure. And so that was the intention. We told DOD, okay, come back and give us the specific programs. Well, they didn't give us anything. Next year, they didn't give us anything. So then last year we said, okay, this is what you're going to spend it on. And we used Indo-PACOM's unfunded requirements list, and we said, this is what it's going to be. You've seen bipartisan criticism on the Hill this year from people who have been through this story, like Leader McConnell, Chairman Jack Reed, saying the Biden request doesn't cut it. It's buying missiles and other things that we were going to buy anyway. It's not the kind of capacity building that has been successful in Europe and that we intend in the Pacific. So I suspect there will be some changes made to that request to better reflect working with partners and allies, in that part of the world.
So it was more of a repackaging as opposed to something capability.
What they did is a repackaging.
Right.
That is not the intention. It's to expand what we can do with partners and allies.
Right.
Could I jump in just a minute? Missile defense is something that is right now. We talk about China and all of the things that are outliers. We're talking right now about Crimea having SSC-8s, which are the INF violating missiles. They're militarizing. We need, right now, for the Black Sea, we need more missile defense. We need more missile defense in the Baltics, and then all of this is going to also play into China, but it's not just 15 years out or 10 years out, it's now.
Well, missile defense, it's a great point. The Missile Defense Agency took a cut, not a large cut, but a cut, which was somewhat surprising when you think about the threats that are growing and things like hypersonics as well. Chairman Thornberry, what is your view of that? I saw with respect to the Pacific Deterrence Initiative as well, the question of does Guam need missile defense, and the radar there, I guess the House Appropriators did not fund. So how do you see that evolving?
Well, and that particular decision was confusing because the command out in Indo-PACOM actually said we could use a lot more money. And so where we are with missile defense is a couple years ago we unexpectedly, to me, canceled a key interceptor program. And so now we've got two teams that are having to reinvent the wheel, if you will. So there is a somewhat of a delay until we kind of figure out what it is we're going to buy. But I think Kay's point is exactly right. Whether you're talking about Europe or the Pacific, there's some infrastructure needs that go with missile defense, some radars and other things we know we need, and the need for that is now.
Great points. And when we're talking about things in space, not just missile defense, we should maybe talk a bit about the standing up of the Space Development Agency. It's now a reality, and the agency seems to have hit the ground running, getting procurement bids out there. Secretary Lord, do you have any advice for these new space companies and other companies that are offering maybe advanced technologies and solutions?
Well, I think General Raymond and Space Force have worked very hard to come out with different industry outreach programs, acquisition programs, the Space Enterprise Consortium, SpaceWorks, there's a Space RCO. I think that companies, especially new space companies, because so much of the talent and capability is out there in the commercial sector, they need to really focus on a couple of things. What is the programmatic direction for Space Force? What is funded? Need to make sure that there are cybersecurity is stellar in this case. Again, the supply chain illumination is very important to make sure they understand beneficial ownership of all the companies in their supply chain. But I think especially where there are a lot of smaller companies with some very niche technologies, they need to think hard about partnering amongst a variety of companies to really bring a solution to Space Force versus another technology. So what is the warfighting gap, if you will? What is the capability gap, and how can that be solved? And again, we need to use technology, these AI-enabled solutions and so forth. So really focus on what those channels are that General Raymond and his team have put in place to really meet Space Force's needs.
Thank you. Chairman Thornberry, you were a real proponent of the Space Force and provided critical support on Capitol Hill. Would love to hear your perspectives on where we're going in space.
Well, I think the number one thing is that it had bipartisan support during a tough time. It continues to have bipartisan support, and that ought to make us all feel better because it doesn't always happen. I think on some of the issues that Ellen was talking about, the goal was to take best practices from the National Reconnaissance Office, from even Special Operations Command, and make sure that the Space Force could move with agility in buying things and trying things. You look at these billionaires and they blow some stuff up. As they learn and they get better, we need to have that sort of tolerance when it comes to the government. And there's still a tension, I think, between these kind of new, faster ways of doing things and the traditional bureaucratic, and that tension has not been resolved yet. And so the next couple years, when it comes to the Space Development Agency and the other parts of Space Force, are going to be the crucial time, I think.
Yeah. And just to build on that, I think we need to get into the messy middle, as I call it, very quickly. Get out there, experiment, fail fast, and keep going. And all the authorities are there. We just need some very clear leadership to say, go do it, and tolerate that learning curve.
Right, and as opposed to canceling a program because of a failed test. I mean, if you look at the Israeli missile defense program, it has evolved very quickly with great capabilities that they've deployed, but they have a tolerance for failure that we don't have in our bureaucracy.
And I think we need to continue to look at launch as a service, for instance. That's been very successful. So a little bit of government money and then commercial industry money, and get competition there. Competition is our friend.
I think I've got one more place to go on our question list. We've hit some very interesting items, but here is one of the big challenges, I think, when we have one of these aspirational budgets and resources that are tight. There's a recurring problem when defense budgets go down, that maintenance and training hours decline, and with that decline in readiness is often an increased risk of accidents and other kinds of failures. Secretary Norquist, what's your view of the impact of this budget on readiness?
Sure. So I think that the first thing is we often use it from readiness. I think what people need to understand is when we spend a lot of time talking about how new our equipment is, how much better our equipment is maybe than other countries, we underestimate the value of the training that our military personnel have, the skill set they bring to the fight, both individually, the courage and the capability, as well as what you need to train to be able to take advantage of these technologies, allows them to do things that others can't even conceive of. Even if you handed them all of our equipment, they wouldn't be able to function the same way because of the incredible amount of discipline and training that our force brings to the fight. And that's why it's so important to protect it. That's why you see people get very concerned when readiness starts to go down and you have submarines tied up against piers because they can't get maintenance, or ships that are having accidents because of training gaps. So protecting this is always high on people's priority. But in the absence of a leadership decision, if you reduce the budget and you don't give direction, right? If there's clear direction, we will reduce the size of this unit, we'll draw down this one. You force people to the only thing that the budget process gives them flexibility over is their training budget. And so if I give a unit and I don't go from 3 units down to 2 or make some other tough choice, but I still cut their budget by that amount, they have no choice but to cancel training. They have no choice but to have these delays. And those consequences aren't always seen immediately. But I think we bring in 250,000 people a year. So if you think about sequestration, we went through years of limited. 250,000 people a year not getting adequately trained and then being sent out to do operations. That's what you really want to avoid. So I think this year, there was an increase in the budget of about $7 billion in O&M, though some of that was a much smaller increase from the previous year's request to this year's. There's normally a switch from O&M to procurement in the marks. That's going to be much harder to maintain. There's a risk if the Hill starts taking too many marks against O&M. There's a hill if the department doesn't give guidance to the services, and that's where they're forced to go, or if it slides out to the command. So I'm not worried about 1 year. Readiness isn't built in a year. It isn't lost in a year. But if you look over 5 years and you don't have clear trade-offs given or clear increases in funding, this will be the default hit, and it'll be to the detriment of the force.
So I'd like to thank our panelists for their very incisive analysis. We've looked at what's in the current budget, where it may be going. Thank you, Chairman Thornberry, Ambassador Hutchison, Secretary Lord, and Secretary Norquist. I think the audience would agree this was a powerhouse panel, and we appreciate you joining us today.